In the temple complexes and trading cities of the ancient Near East and Egypt, henbane appeared in clay-recorded recipes and papyri collections, cited for its properties to ease pain, induce sleep, and quiet nervous disorders. Priests and temple healers blended it with wine, crushed it into poultices, or burned it in rituals meant to contact the divine. But outside temples, the knowledge of dosage and preparation travelled more loosely. Local vendors offered dried herbs by smell, texture, or guesswork, often without agreement on which nightshade they were really selling. The danger lay in the plant's similarity to other solanaceous species. Fresh or dried, henbane could be confused with wild relatives like mandrake or thorn-apple, especially by merchants or household buyers lacking formal training. In busy open markets from Thebes to Mari, demand for sleep remedies and love charms encouraged quick substitutions when supply ran short. Patients who expected mild sedation instead convulsed, gasped, or wandered into hallucination. Officials rarely traced the source. Instead, sudden deaths were ascribed to spirits, fate, or angered gods. Without standardized naming or written labeling practices, even careful healers struggled to verify what they received. In some Egyptian inventories, the glyph for henbane overlaps with terms for other narcotic plants, blurring distinctions across languages and scribal schools. This ambiguity created a split. Temples and elite households maintained cautious handling through enclosed gardens, while the broader population risked whatever a seller claimed was healing. Over time, the rising toll forced temple authorities to restrict plant distribution, but outside the walls, the trade grew harder to monitor and even less controlled. Greek medical theory prized balance, hot and cold, dry and wet. Into this structure, henbane entered as a useful but perilous tool. Physicians, following the tradition of Hippocrates, described it as cooling and sleep-inducing, especially when made into infusions or seed-based pastes. Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century CE, warned that it should never be taken in wine, which could intensify its effects uncontrollably. Yet despite such cautions, the plant's reputation as a natural anesthetic made it popular far beyond the clinics, used in homes by midwives and among herbalists with no formal training. The problem was that henbane rarely grew alone. Throughout the Greek mainland, and even more so in Asia Minor and southern Italy, the wild hillsides were thick with multiple nightshades: mandrake, black nightshade, thorn apple, all sharing similar leaf shapes or seed capsules. Since most lay practitioners harvested plants by visual cues, it became easy to pick the wrong one. Henbane seeds in particular, dark and wrinkled, were mistaken for those of more benign herbs. Incidents of sudden paralysis or terrifying visions prompted written warnings that henbane's fumes alone could suffocate or seize the brain. But such alerts rarely reached rural markets where the dried root or seed was sold unlabeled and untested. Even among literate physicians, confusion spread through copying errors and blurred classifications. Manuscripts sometimes listed different types of henbane by region, black, white, and yellow, without consistent botanical markers, leaving the practitioner to guess based on local growth. That ambiguity proved costly. Collections like the Hippocratic Corpus advised various strengths for internal or external use, but lacked exact measurements, inviting misinterpretation. And as city buyers sought pre-ground powders or prepared drafts, they placed their trust in sellers whose sources might include contaminated wild mixtures. The result was a drug regarded as both remedy and threat, already slipping beyond prescription and into the unpredictable hands of the marketplace. In Roman households, medical care often began and ended at the kitchen bench. Practical remedies passed down by matronae included herbs for sleep, fertility, or affection, many drawn from the garden or purchased from local stalls. Henbane, with its strange odour and narcotic powers, appeared in recipes for toothaches, insomnia, and love draughts alike. Its seeds, boiled in oil or crushed into vinegar, were used to dull pain or stir passion. Roman texts warned of its potency, but in private homes those borders blurred. Desire for effective cures outweighed caution. Household servants or elder women prepared draughts without scales, using approximations taught by memory or guesswork. Dosages wandered. A spoon too much could cause delirium, slowed pulse, or violent visions mistaken for possession or madness. Instead of calling physicians who charged fees and might report suspicious remedies, families often concealed the results. A failed love potion, when it resulted in collapse or uncontrollable speech, was passed off as a fever. More disturbingly, deaths from misused henbane drew little attention unless they triggered household scandal. This silence helped the use of the plant persist, but it quietly shifted its handling out of respectable kitchens. Sellers who once hawked herbs in city markets began catering discreetly to women, slaves, and the superstitious through backdoor trades and coded recommendations. As henbane slipped from official recipes into back-channel hands, it became the province of charm workers, unlicensed figures who promised remedies, fortunes, or affections for a coin. Many claimed secret knowledge of safe amounts passed down in private rites or whispered by spirits. But their access to true plant identification was no better than the households that failed before them. With demand growing and no legal oversight, dried powders were padded with lookalikes or stretched with toxic fillers. When poisonings occurred, they were rarely traced back. Buyers feared confession more than sickness. Rome's herb trade widened, but trusted knowledge thinned, and what remained drifted further into the grey zone beyond formal medicine. Across early medieval Europe, monastic communities became the keepers of inherited medical knowledge. In scriptoriums from Fulda to Canterbury, monks copied Latin herbals based on Roman and Greek sources, scrupulously reproducing entries on plants like henbane. In enclosed physic gardens, they cultivated it under controlled supervision, labelling it by appearance and use. The texts they preserved included dosing instructions, preparation methods, and qualities like cooling or moistening, all steeped in Galenic theory, but accuracy depended on the copy at hand, and mistranslations crept in with every generation of manual transcription. One misplaced line or altered numeral could change a sedative into a poison. Some manuscripts inflated recommended doses or reversed cautions, errors unnoticed by copying monks unfamiliar with pharmacological effects. When these texts entered lay hands, often through simplified leech books adapted for non-clerical use, mistakes multiplied. Outside the monastery, farmers and housewives, inspired by the monks' apparent success, attempted their own cures. They boiled henbane seeds for fever, or pressed them into ointments for nerve pain, believing they followed holy medicine. The results were cause for alarm. Convulsions, muteness, and unexplainable trances took hold in villages where no physician could make sense of the outcome. The authority of scriptural medicine gave these remedies protection from suspicion, but not from consequence. As more lay people mimicked monastic recipes without first-hand training or access to the carefully tended physic gardens, deviations increased. Dried herb bundles purchased at markets bore names, but not provenance. With monasteries spread thin and travelling clergy unable to inspect vernacular practices, errors once confined to scribes began to affect entire communities. Misidentified plants, faulty doses, and untested preparations no longer stayed inside copied books. They became actions and their failures, harder to untangle from the mysticism and blame that would soon follow. By the 12th century, surgical practice in European cities had begun to include henbane as a crude anaesthetic. Barber surgeons, operating in churches, fairs, or battlefield tents, used mashed seeds or leaves soaked in wine to numb patients before tooth pulling, cauterization, or limb removal. The logic was simple. If the herb dulled sensation and brought sleep, it might spare the patient from agony. Recipes spread through surgical manuals and apprenticeships, some pairing henbane with hemlock or opium poppy in a mix called soporific sponge. The goal was unconsciousness, brief, deep, and reversible. But such outcomes proved difficult to control. What dulled one patient sent another into convulsions. When crushed plants were boiled too long or left to steep too little, the potency shifted wildly. Some who inhaled the sponge's fumes sank into a listless sleep and never woke. Others screamed against restraints, hallucinating wildly or tearing at their wounds. Surgeons, lacking precise measures or true understanding of the plant's effects, responded by stacking remedies, adding belladonna, mandrake, or alcohol to intensify the mix. Instead of improving results, these combinations raised the risk, creating volatile concoctions that terrified even experienced assistants. As failures mounted, written warnings circulated among medical guilds and monastic hospitals urging restraint or dilution. But the demand for pain relief, especially in urban centres where crude procedures were daily events, kept pace with experimentation. No regulatory body enforced uniformity, and no supplier guaranteed purity. Dried henbane arrived in sacks from unknown fields, mixed with weeds or mould, already variable in strength. The line between medicine and poison grew thinner with every botched dose. By the century's end, surgical anaesthetics had become guesswork, and the faith placed in them demanded stronger brews, not safer ones. By the mid-14th century, as plague spread from port cities into rural Europe, demand for protective remedies surged across all social classes. Markets, back alleys, and makeshift shrines offered herbal sachets, bitter brews, and smoked candles, claimed to shield against miasmas or strengthen the soul. Henbane, with its acrid scent and long-standing associations with sleep and spirits, entered these routines not as a drug, but as a ward. In hamlets with no physicians and towns with overwhelmed clergy, local cunning folk blended henbane in fumigations, amulets, or potions meant to guard the body from death. Its presence was rarely questioned until it backfired. Symptoms from these mixtures began surfacing in clusters: tremors, confusion, babbling, or dreams mistaken for visions. Parish records from Flemish border towns noted sudden incidences of madness by vapour, while Florentine notaries described healers accused of summoning devils through herbs. The line between preventative and poison blurred quickly when users, especially children and the elderly, fell into frenzied trances after ingesting or inhaling unknown quantities. As these events multiplied, suspicion turned not toward the plant itself, but those who handled it: herb women, charm sellers, and fringe apothecaries. The herbalist who once offered aid became, in the eyes of neighbours, a possible agent of decay. The mechanism of supply deepened the problem. Henbane reached these folk healers dried, unlabelled, or bundled with similar-looking weeds, and its dosing depended on counted seeds or vague boiling times. Without gardens of their own, many gathered what they could from waste patches or bartered bunches sourced from travelling hucksters. As fear mounted, those who had once relied on these remedies now began reporting their makers. Testimonials of strange behaviours following strange brews entered civic logs, often without clear proof, and the same dose that caused no harm one week might knock the next patient into delirium. Trust fractured, but the need for protection didn't, and into that crack stepped fear, ready to make accusations stick. By the early 1400s, as lay courts and inquisitorial tribunals widened their remit to cases of sorcery, henbane began to appear in depositions not merely as a drug, but as a medium of transit, said to carry witches through the air or into nocturnal gatherings with the devil. Descriptions varied. Some said it was mixed into ointments rubbed on the skin. Others described dark draughts that dulled fear and blurred memory. Accusers spoke of women flying on livestock, merely believing they could, or waking in strange locations after cursed sleep. Authorities, already seeking tools to identify malefice, latched onto this herb as a suspect accelerant, not only a poison, but a key to impossible acts. What followed were confessions, frequently procured under duress, that linked henbane to flight, shapeshifting, or communion with demons. But the accounts contradicted one another. Some declared the ointment caused levitation. Others claimed they never left their room. Few could explain how or why the mixture worked. In Freiburg, trial records described a woman who named henbane among the plants used in her Sabbath ointment, but could not replicate its effects. In Toulouse, another swore that a familiar spirit instructed her to boil the root, though she'd earlier denied ever using plants. This inconsistency deepened rather than solved suspicion. Investigators didn't need coherence, they needed confirmation. The more fragmented the story, the easier it was to attribute the gaps to devilish deceit. Henbane's known properties, dizziness, hallucination, numbness, fit too well with the outcomes prosecutors believed marked diabolic acts. Yet its effect was unstable and shifted wildly between users. The same paste that sent one woman into a trance left another unaffected. That made precise testing impossible, but lent credibility to the belief that supernatural forces were involved. Worse, the plant's association with hidden rites made formal physicians reluctant to speak in its defense. As legal records amassed with ritualistic language and jumbled recipes, medical explanation lost ground. By the century's end, accused women were no longer just healers. They were witches whose knowledge of henbane had crossed a border that could not be uncrossed. By the height of Europe's witch trials, the testimonies of the accused had begun to follow patterns too consistent to ignore. Flight, hallucination, lovers turned to beasts, bodies gripped by paralysis and sudden lucidity. While theologians framed these as signs of witchcraft, some physicians and Protestant critics began to suspect chemical causes. Johann Weyer, a court doctor in the Holy Roman Empire, proposed that plants like henbane could explain the altered states without invoking demonic powers. He noted its effects: numbness, confusion, visions, as strikingly similar to the dreams described in confessions. But his warnings arrived in courts already tuned to hear guilt, not chemistry. Authorities treated these arguments not as clarifications, but as risks to established prosecutions. In witch trials across Bavaria, Lorraine and Scotland, where symptoms followed familiar arcs, violent tremors, trance, waking amnesia, naturalistic explanations were dismissed as tactics to absolve malefactors. If a potion caused madness, it proved demonic influence, not medicinal error. When skeptics suggested that such herbs might have produced real effects without witchcraft, judges countered that intention was what mattered. that brewing visions from henbane still meant consorting with infernal forces. In court records, herb of the devil became a category unto itself, blurring any line between pharmacology and pact. The result was a paradox. Henbane was granted implicit credibility, not as a pharmacological agent, but as evidence of witchcraft's reach. Its presence in a bundle, garden, or recipe bolstered the case for sorcery, even when it may have caused the symptoms itself. This widened the net. Any convulsion, stupor, or enchanted narrative could now be linked back to natural but misunderstood toxins. Meanwhile, claims like wires lacked traction outside academic circles, rarely informing village trials or local investigators. Instead, courts doubled down. The more henbane could cause illusions, the more it proved the devil had acted through it. And with that logic, explanation became part of the accusation itself. In the expanding medical economies of the 17th and 18th centuries, licensed apothecaries and physicians sought to bring discipline to a substance long associated with disorder. Henbane, now listed in published pharmacopoeias from London to Leipzig, appeared in approved formulas for nervous complaints, toothache, seizures, and surgical sedation. Dosage tables attempted to resolve centuries of confusion, offering dried weight recommendations and standardized tinctures. But these measures assumed a constant strength in the raw plant, an assumption rarely met when supplies came from wild sources, scattered rural growers, or foreign exporters with no shared classification system. As demand rose, so did shortcuts. In apothecary shops and supply chains, henbane was frequently adulterated to stretch inventory or match expected appearances. Powdered mixtures contained mouldy leaves, ground bark, or unrelated solanaceous plants, often without clear botanical origin. In several widely reported incidents, including cases in Paris, Nuremberg, and Bath, patients given legitimate preparations experienced rapid onset hallucinations, paralysis, or death. Public outcry followed, not only against suspicious folk healers, but against licensed physicians whose credentials failed to prevent harm. Pamphlets denounced both quacks and academics, accusing them of trafficking dangerously in poisons described with Latin words few could challenge. The inconsistencies of henbane's effect, effective in one clinic, lethal in another, exposed the limits of early pharmacy's ambition. Even when compounders followed printed formulas precisely, the plant's variable alkaloid content, influenced by soil, season, or storage, made outcomes unpredictable. Regulatory bodies were few, local, and often powerless to test what was sold. The result was erosion on both fronts. Licensed medicine lost credibility among patients, while unlicensed sellers faced growing persecution. But the plant itself didn't fade. Instead, it hovered in a dangerous middle ground, too known to ban outright, too unstable to fully trust, fueling deeper suspicion, just as the Enlightenment promised reason and reform. In official dispensaries from Naples to Edinburgh, henbane remained a listed substance, recognized by name, recorded by weight, prescribed by function. It appeared in state-approved formularies and behind the doors of licensed apothecaries, still suggested for neuralgia, tooth pain, or sleep disorders. But in practice, many physicians began omitting it from hospital treatments, warning colleagues in letters and lectures that the margin between relief and calamity was too slim to justify casual use. Municipal councils, faced with petitions from relatives of victims, began issuing informal bans on its inclusion in dispensary compounding, even as no law had yet forbidden it outright. Cases piled up in court records and coroner reports, a patient in Lyon convulsing after a mislabeled vial, a surgeon in Prague charged when his soporific mixture ended in death instead of sedation. The problem was rarely criminal intent, it was inconsistency. Henbane tinctures varied not only by region, but by how long the leaves had dried, where the plant had been foraged, or how it had been stored. Without calibration, even small errors escalated. Jurors inclined to leniency still urged tighter control, while insurers began excluding unchecked botanicals from covered treatments. Hospitals, hoping to meet rising Enlightenment ideals of cleanliness and predictability, moved decisively to eliminate the herb from routine use. That withdrawal, however, created a divide. Henbane did not vanish, it shifted. In cities, it disappeared from institutional shelves, but in rural apothecaries and among independent vendors, it persisted as a whispered remedy, unlisted but requested, deniable but delivered. Printed pharmacopoeias still carried instructions, yet actual training discouraged its use. The herb was now split between sanctioned knowledge and prohibited application. And in that gap, supervision faltered. Local authorities, lacking formal inspection powers, could neither confirm nor suppress what was quietly sold. By the early 1800s, henbane had become a plant named in law books but used in silence, its risk removed from clinics but not from circulation.